The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. That is a line that has been passed down to us from one of the most famous accounts of one of the most famous wars in history. It was written by Thucydides. It comes from the most popular chapter of his book or treatise on the Peloponnesian War. And it is the basis for one of the schools of thought known as realpolitik or realism or the real world or hard-nosed power, or however you want to describe the fact that you may not take an interest in reality, but reality may take an interest in you. And this is something that I have talked a lot about over the years as it relates to the way I see markets, the way I see geopolitics, and the way I see society function in general. And it has been a huge impact on kind of my overall framework. And I'm sure those of you who have heard me talk before are familiar with this line of thinking. Now, I've talked about it a lot. Let me back up here a little bit here. I've actually talked a lot about it, not just over the last several years, but a lot year to date. In fact, at the beginning of the year, I had my friend John Butler write a guest piece for our research service, and he highly referenced the Peloponnesian War and the Melian dialogue and the Thucydides trap, as it were, in his what I thought was a fantastic essay. He and I then did a podcast a few months later, subsequent to the outbreak of the war with Iran. And then I followed that up a few weeks later or a month later with my own take on it. And so it has really been a rather influential piece, not just over the last several years, but specifically year to date. And that's what we're going to talk about it again today, partly because I think it's really important, but mostly because I just listened to a fantastic podcast earlier this week, and it was on this subject. And it just reminded me of so many things, not just about what I already knew, but about how you always have to question your own assumptions, and you always have to understand the other side of the story. Now, I tweeted it out, and I said, this is just another must-listen-to show by my friend Dimitri Kofinas. He's got a podcast called Hidden Forces. And I basically said, so listen, I don't agree with all the conclusions. And in fact, I disagree with many of them, but it's just another example of two sides to every story. And it's important to understand each. And this podcast was the other side of the Thucydides trap. And it was the other side in more ways than one. And I've just been thinking about it all week after listening to it. And I would highly recommend, if you guys are not familiar with Dimitri's on the left here. If you're not familiar with Dimitri Kofinas and his podcast, Hidden Forces, to me, it's one of the best ones out there. I listen to it all the time, and he's just been on fire lately so he always has great guests, but just recently, he's just really been on fire. And I really, really enjoyed this one. And I would highly recommend. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on different podcast, apps. Anyway, I would recommend that you go and listen to it. If this type of stuff is of interest to you, I would recommend that you go and listen to it. But it comes back to this one line because this is the most famous line, and it basically says, "The strong do what they can; the weak suffer what they must." Now, to me, the most interesting part of the podcast was that Kirshner, the Jonathan Kirshner, who Dimitri interviewed for this dialogue, makes the claim that despite that being the most famous line out of the most famous chapter, out of the most famous account of the Peloponnesian War, is dramatically misunderstood, and that it's actually been read backwards. And so, again, it's just it's fascinating to me that you can think you understand a topic, and then when you hear somebody else who's an expert on it or understands it very well comes to a different interpretation, I just find it endless interesting, I guess. Now I may be rambling here a little bit, but again, I've been thinking about it all week, and it basically, what he is saying is that Thucydides and the Melian dialogue is not a defense of raw power, which is often how it is interpreted. And in fact, he says it's the setup for the catastrophe that followed the use of raw power. And this has been popularized as, the Thucydides trap. But he says the real trap is not that a rising power is eventually going to come into conflict with the established one. He says the trap is when a rising power or an established power becomes too confident and they make the mistakes that lead to their eventual demise. And so it's just a different way of looking at the same problem. And that's what we're gonna go. I'm gonna kind of summarize Jonathan's thoughts as I interpreted them from the podcast. I think you should all listen to it yourself because you might have a different interpretation than me. But I'm going to tell you my interpretation of it, and we'll go from there. But the part of the reason I think it's pretty interesting is I think a lot of people are familiar, at least recently, and perhaps for people who are not scholars, who are not historical scholars of Greek history or military history, I think the average person who is familiar, at least recently, with this topic is probably familiar with it because there was a very popular book written 5, 6, 7, maybe 10 years ago, which we've referenced in previous podcasts, called Destined for War. And it was called by Graham Allison. And he talks about Thucydides' trap, and it's about China rising against the established power of the United States. And is there a way for the United States and China to avoid this trap? And 3 or 4 times in the last 10 years, Xi himself, Chairman Xi of China, has referenced the Thucydides trap. So it's not like this is some obscure idea or some obscure topic. It is very relevant to everything that's going on today. And Kirshner, he didn't think it was a good book. So I think that was another interesting part of it. He kind of, dismissed the book as, it was okay, but nothing any scholar would give high praise to. And I just found that interesting in and of itself. But again, it reminded me that you can read a book about something and it can be very well written, very popular, get very good reviews, but it isn't necessarily right. So again, there's just 2 sides to every story. That's what we're gonna discuss here. Before I get too deep into it, I do want to remind everybody about Monetary Metals. Many of you know I joined the board of Monetary Metals a little over a year ago. I've enjoyed knowing these guys for a long time. I've enjoyed being on their board. And the reason I think it's particularly important this year is, last year, obviously, gold had a fantastic year and people made a lot of money just on the capital gain of their holding. Now, this year has been a different story. Gold and silver are both down significantly since the outbreak of the war. We've talked about that on previous podcasts and the reason for that happening. But I think in many ways, the fact of if gold goes sideways or doesn't have a great year in the same way it had last year, it doesn't mean you shouldn't own it, but it also doesn't mean you can't put it to productive use. And that's what Monetary Metals does. They have a way for you to own gold, own bullion, have it safely stored, but also earn a yield on it. And so, right now you can earn around 4%, which is pretty similar to what you get on a T-bill or a short-term treasury. But have it backed by gold rather than having it backed by, a government. So in any case, I would encourage everybody, if you're not already familiar with Monetary Metals, go to monetary-metals.com/Santiago, and you can learn more about it. And if anybody has questions, they can email me about it, and I can put you in touch with them. But I think it's something that everybody should be at least familiar with. But as it comes back to the Melian dialogue, and both Kirshner's view of Thucydides, which is in contrast with Graham Allison's more popularized version of Thucydides, it all centers around the Peloponnesian War, which is essentially the civil war in many ways within Greece, the 2 great city-states, Athens and Sparta. And it took place in like 3 different phases over almost 30 years. And as Kirchner says, the war itself was not the trap. That's what Allison claimed. But Kirchner's claim is that it's what Athens became while fighting it, which was the trap. And so, he also claimed that in many ways, contrary to Allison, that this was not something that they just stumbled into. He said both sides were extremely aware of what was happening. They entered the war with eyes wide open. Thucydides was a general from Athens. Pericles was the governor or the president, however I don't remember what the exact name of the leader of Athens was. But Pericles had a very, very careful strategy. It was very prudent, was not reckless at all. And Thucydides backed him, and they went to war with Sparta, which was the bigger, more established power. And as they went along, as Athens had more and more success during this war, they became more and more prideful, I suppose is the right way to say it. And they became more reckless. And that is what Kirchner says is where the catastrophe starts. And this is the part, and this is why he says Thucydides focuses on the Melian dialogue, which in many ways is not an important part of the overall war. But this is where he says Thucydides takes time on this to explain what happened. And anyway, but going back to the quote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Again, it's lifted out of one of the books or one of the chapters of the book, and he states this issue of the strong doing what they can and the weak suffer. He says it once, but he refers to it over and over and over throughout the book, but he never endorses it, and that's Kirchner's claim. He says even though he refers to it a lot, he never says this is an appropriate way to act. And in fact, it's kind of the opposite. And so this is kind of the ironic thing is the line that made Thucydides famous as kind of the father of realism or realpolitik or however you want to describe that is actually a misinterpretation. And Kirchner makes the argument that if you actually read the full book, that Thucydides is probably the biggest critic of realism or of power politics or of gunboat diplomacy or however you want to describe that. So again, just a very interesting dichotomy between what one person thinks and what somebody else thinks. But if we go back to the book itself, the reason it's the book on the Peloponnesian War, the reason it's so popular is Thucydides. He had a lot of credibility. He was a general in the war. He wasn't a bystander who just kind of, took a passing interest in it. Not only that, but he lost a battle early on and was exiled to an island as a punishment for losing. And he spent that time, rather than just laying in the sun and eating olives, he dedicated his time to studying the war, understanding the war, critiquing the war, and then writing about it. And so again, it was about a 27-year period that the war took. So I mean, it's a very, very long time. Maybe half of somebody's lifetime back then. And he about 25% of the time he focuses on the Battle of Sicily. And through that, he makes it very clear that is what he thinks is the most important part of it. And yet it's this Melian dialogue that is the most popular and is the most well-known historically. And so we'll get through what that is. And so the other thing that made it kind of interesting is that, he wasn't a preacher. He wasn't lecturing anybody. He wasn't saying, this is what you need to take from this. In many ways, he was letting you make your own decision. I don't think he was necessarily like Socrates, where he would just ask a bunch of questions, but he didn't just say, this is the way it is. But if you focus on what he focused on, you can start to understand what he thought was important. One of the first, and you got to remember, this is originally written in Greek, and then it's been translated into English a few different times. But one of the first translators said that Thucydides never stops and gives a lecture, but the narration that he gives is itself as kind of a secret clue as to what he wants the reader to understand. One of the other, translators said he strives for perfect scholarly objectivity. In other words, he tries very hard, not in writing to say this is what you should take from it. He tries to be very objective. But despite trying to be very objective, the stuff that he chooses to write about ends up telling you what it is that he wants you to know, because he actually leaves out a bunch of stuff that many other historians think are just as important. So kind of a lesson by omission is perhaps one way to think about it. And the other thing is, he would write, sometimes he would kind of spend, paragraphs or pages talking about one battle or one issue, and then only, a couple sentences or one paragraph on something else that is of equal importance. And so, he said a full year of fighting could vanish into a paragraph, and yet a minor episode could run for pages and pages. And that is what, Kirchner says, that's where he wants you to really focus, because that's when he's trying to teach. And Milos, which is where the Melian dialogue comes from, is the extreme case. So the Melian dialogue is basically, it's a dialogue between the leaders of Milos and the leaders of Athens. And it's the dialogue that they have. And Milos was essentially a neutral island, let's call it Switzerland, right? Who said, listen, you want to have your war with Sparta, that's great. We're neutral. We don't really care who wins. We're just farmers. We're traders. We make goods. We trade with everybody. Just leave us out of it. Go have your war and leave us out of it. And Athens basically said, no. Again, you may not take an interest in reality, but reality may take an interest in you. Athens said, no, either surrender or you'll be destroyed. And so this is like halfway through the war. And again, Milos is not even like a strategically important island or anything. But halfway through the war, and this is actually during a time where there's a short-term peace between Sparta and Athens, and that for whatever reason, Athens pulls up and says, "You now belong to us. Surrender or be destroyed." And Milos says, "Leave us alone. We don't want anything." And they refused. And so, what does Athens do? They kill every man on the island, and they take the women, and they sell the women and children into slavery. So basically burn the place to the ground, essentially, right? And then they put take their own citizens from Athens, and they repopulate the island, with their new pioneers or colonialists, whatever you want to determine that, right? And so, what's interesting here is in the entire book, this is the only part that they go through this dialogue back and forth between Athens and Milos, and they talk about what each side said, and it's a debate. It's basically a debate between the two sides. So the chapter or the part of the book is not Athens storming the beaches and killing everybody. The main part is the dialogue, the debate between the two sides that ultimately ended in Athens destroying Milos. But this is where there's kind of a mystery about this. Why does he spend so much time focusing on Milos, which is kind of an out of the way backwater that nobody really cared about? It wasn't strategically important. Not only that, it didn't have any effect on the overall war. And this has happened many times before. It happened before many times. And so why he chose to focus on Milos is not really understood. But the fact that he did is what's it's kind of a mystery, but it's also the part that has been passed down through history the most. And the thing is, they had done this exact same thing 5 years before, a place called Sion. 5 years before, Athens did the identical thing. They killed the men, they killed they took the women and the children, and they gave the land away. And in that case, Thucydides gave it one sentence and moved on. So why he chose Milos, we don't know. Maybe it's just because it was the most extreme example and he wanted to make a point out of this type of thing. And rather than doing it, 5 times in a few short paragraphs, he decided to do it one time over many pages. But that is kind of a mystery. But essentially, what it was is they had even they gave an example of the same thing happened with another place. So there's Milos, but then there's Mytilene. So Mytilene had actually, Milos actually didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do anything to help Sparta. They didn't revolt against Athens. They basically just said, again, just leave us alone. But Mytilene, they actually were an ally of Athens, who then turned around and tried to defect to Sparta. So they had betrayed Athens. And in that case, Athens voted to go do the same thing, to burn them to the ground and kill all the men and women, or kill all the men. And they sent a ship to do it. Here, I thought this was pretty interesting. And then the next morning, they said, holy cow, that's pretty extreme. And they sent another ship to chase after the first one. And apparently the other ship got there just in time to stop the first ship from doing this. But again, the point is that this had happened 10 years before, and Athens had spared Mytilene, but they didn't spare Milos. And Kirchner's argument, and this is the trap that he talks about, is that it wasn't going to war with a greater power. It was becoming too coarse, too above it all, too prideful, too arrogant. And that, he said, was the trap. And so the city that had revolted against its own cruelty had now performed it without a second thought. So again, whereas they spared Mytilene, 10 years later, they didn't even think about it. They just slaughtered everybody. And this is an example of the trap, the corruption, the gluttony, the greed, is what ultimately did in Athens. So that was kind of an interesting story about it. And so that leads to the real trap. And so this is where he says the bill eventually comes due. Pride, then the fall, right? And so right after they slaughtered Milos, after the Melian dialogue, they set sail for Sicily. And that, they went in full of swagger, full of confidence, and basically they got their asses kicked, for lack of a better way of saying it, right? The army, the fleet was destroyed, the army destroyed. A few were able to escape and fled home. And long story short, Athens just never recovered. And so this is where Kirchner kind of explains that where Graham Allison said Thucydides' trap was a rising power Athens versus the established power Sparta, that was Allison's trap. Kirchner says that Thucydides himself thought the trap came later with the hubris. Now, the reason I find this pretty interesting right now is what happened earlier this year. The United States went into Venezuela, extremely successful, didn't have any trouble at all, got in and out in a few hours, and great victory. And then a few weeks later, they take off for Iran, and that's not quite going quite as well. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think these are the same, and I actually come down on the other side of it. But my point is, I have to understand the other side of my own argument. And I think this is a fantastic example of how that can happen if you let it get away from you. And so I've said this many times, and I'm going to say it again and again. People are going to get sick of me saying it. However sure you are of your position, however much conviction you have, you still have to understand the other side of the story. And so in Kirshner's view, and in Thucydides' view, the backfire is the problem. So the blowback. And so, from Thucydides' perspective, brutality is not merely ugly and gross and just not necessary, but it's actually counterproductive. And he shows this again and again and again through his stuff. It happened with Sparta, it happened with Athens, and it happened many, many times. And so this is not a unique event. And this is his point is, yeah, you can use gunboat diplomacy, you can do power politics, you can roll up and say surrender or die, but it will eventually come back and bite you. And so, that's the difference between the swagger and the bill, right? Strength answers to nothing. They don't ask permission. They just go and they do. The problem is that swagger also breeds enemies, right? And so, Thucydides answers this time and time and time again in the book. Cruelty drives allies to your rival, and it turns those who were neutral into enemies. And that's nowhere better explained than through this whole Melian dialogue. And so the self-defeating arrogance and the hubris, that is the trap, and not necessarily the fact that Athens was now taking on a greater power in Sparta. So in all of the lessons of the book, that is the one that Thucydides thought was the most important. So again, the bottom line is the Melians were right. Then in the dialogue, the Melians said to the Athenians, if you destroy us, then everyone else who is neutral and is watching will conclude that they are next, and you will make enemies of everybody that is now neutral. And at the end of the war, Sparta's allies argue, and the other thing is they said, you might want to be careful about killing all of us, because if you happen to lose to Sparta, they may kill all of you. And so I thought that was a pretty interesting lesson as well. And then, long story short, he's saying, the famous line, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must, is very decontextualized. It's taken to mean one thing when in many ways he argues it means another. And if you read the whole book rather than just the sentence, you come to a dramatically different conclusion. So anyway, that's my summary. I think this whole thing is fascinating. Again, I don't agree with a lot of the conclusions that Kirshner came to in it, but again, it's important to understand. You can read something, you can read a great book. You might want to read somebody else's take on the book because they might open your eyes to some other parts that you were not already aware of. So at the end of the day, this is a show that we talk oftentimes about financial markets. So why am I talking about the Melian dialogue so much? We've talked about it 3 or 4 times this year. What the hell does it have to do with markets? Well, on the one hand, nothing. It's just an interesting piece of history. And on the other hand, everything. And the reason I say everything is if you want to know, there's a famous line, I don't remember who said it, but if you want to know the future, look to the past. There's nothing new under the sun. And I think we are in a world now, I've said this many, many times, where the pendulum is now swinging from globalization to deglobalization. The pendulum is swinging from cooperation to non-cooperation. The pendulum is swinging from the greater good to America first. And all of that stuff has consequences. And for much of my life and much of my career, macro hasn't really mattered. Geopolitics hasn't really mattered when it comes to markets. But I think we are now swinging into an area where macro and geopolitics and the madness of crowds, whether the madness has to do with the citizens or whether the madness has to do with the governments or whether the madness has to do with the central bankers. I think that is the environment in which we're moving. And so while on the one hand, perhaps this means nothing, I happen to think it means everything. So anyway, thanks everybody for listening. If you like this type of stuff, this is the type of stuff we talk about, we write about. If you get a chance, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, go check us out at santiagocapital.com. And if you want to subscribe to the research that we put out related to this, you can go to research.santiagocapital.com. Okay, guys, peace. See you next week.